January 1944. London was a city held together by nothing but steel cables, barrage balloons, and the frayed nerves of a world on the brink. The air was thick with coal smoke and the invisible weight of a secret so large it threatened to crush everyone involved. Inside a nondescript brick building at 20 Grosvenor Square, the lights burned long into the night, casting long skeletal shadows across walls covered in top-secret maps. This was the nerve center of the Western world, and at its heart sat a man who had become a master of the impossible. General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat enveloped in a permanent cloud of 4-pack-a-day cigarette smoke. As the supreme Allied commander, he was the chief architect of an operation so vast it defied human comprehension. Operation Overlord. Eisenhower was not a traditional blood and guts commander. He was a diplomat in 4-star shoulder straps. A man whose primary weapons were the telephone, the seating chart, and a supernatural ability to keep the massive egos of Winston Churchill, Charles de Gaulle, and Bernard Montgomery from tearing the Allied alliance apart. He was the calm, methodical center of a world-ending storm. He lived his life in a series of endless meetings, managing the cold, mathematical logic of logistics dunnage, fuel, tide charts, and troop rotations. He understood that D-Day would be won by the man who made fewer mistakes on paper. But as he stared at the Normandy coast on his map, Eisenhower knew a terrifying truth. You can plan a war with logic, but you have to win it with violence, too. Break Hitler's Atlantic Wall. He didn't just need a planner, he needed a killer. That killer was currently 3,000 miles away, pacing the floors of a villa in Sicily like a caged tiger. George S. Patton was a man out of time. He was a warrior who believed in reincarnation, convinced he had led legions for Rome and cavalry for Napoleon. He didn't just fight wars, he breathed them. He was the most lethal tank commander the United States had ever produced, a man who understood speed, shock, and the absolute necessity of relentless aggression. But Patton was also his own greatest enemy. Months earlier, during the campaign in Sicily, he had done the unthinkable. In an evacuation hospital, he had encountered 2 soldiers suffering from battle fatigue, what we now know as PTSD. Patton, a man who viewed psychological trauma as a personal insult to his code of honor, had slapped them. He called them cowards. He threatened to shoot them. The slapping incident had hit the Allied High Command like a grenade. It was a scandal that threatened to shatter the American public's support for the war and alienate the British. For any other general, it would have been the end. But Eisenhower, despite his fury, had saved him. He hadn't saved Patton because he liked him, their friendship had been strained to the point of breaking, but because of a cold, strategic calculation. Eisenhower knew that the German Wehrmacht feared no American general more than George S. Patton. To the Germans, Patton was the Phantom. He was the only Allied commander they truly respected. They studied his tactics with a religious intensity, convinced that wherever Patton was, the main blow would fall. Eisenhower's solution to the Patton problem was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. He brought Patton to England, but he didn't give him an army to lead. Instead, he gave him an army to pretend to lead. Eisenhower placed Patton in command of the 1st United States Army Group, or FUSAG. On paper, it was a massive force, poised to invade the Pas-de-Calais, the shortest distance between England and France. In reality, FUSAG was a ghost. It consisted of inflatable rubber tanks, wooden airplanes, and a handful of radio operators sending fake messages into the ether. Patton was the lead actor in a giant theater of deception. He was the bait. Eisenhower was using the legend of his best general to blind the eyes of the German high command. Patton was humiliated. He felt like a warrior being told to play with toys while the world went to war. But Eisenhower remained firm. He kept the leash tight, knowing that Patton's ego was a small price to pay for the success of D-Day. The architect was in control, but he knew that once the real earthquake began, the leash would have to be cut. By July 1944, the euphoria of the D-Day landings had vanished, replaced by the grim, stagnant reality of the Normandy hedgerows, the bocage. Eisenhower's grand plan was bogged down in a landscape designed for defense. For 7 weeks, the Allies had been trading lives for yards, stuck in a claustrophobic maze of ancient earthworks and German 88mm guns. Eisenhower, sitting in his tent in the rain, was feeling the pressure from Washington and London. The public wanted a breakout. The politicians wanted a victory. The methodical, broad front strategy he favored was failing. The alliance was fraying. Montgomery, the British commander, was cautious to a fault, and the American press was beginning to ask why their armies were standing still. Eisenhower knew he could no longer afford the luxury of patience. He looked at his map, looked at the stagnant lines near Saint-Lay, and finally reached for the one weapon he had kept in reserve. He called for the man in the polished helmet. He called for George S. Patton. On August 1st, 1944, Patton's Third Army was officially activated. It was as if Eisenhower had pulled the pin on a grenade and dropped it into the lap of the German High Command. Patton didn't just move his army, he launched it. In what historians would later call the greatest blitzkrieg in history, Patton's armor tore through the German lines, bypassing strong points and racing into the open plains of France, while the other Allied commanders moved with the caution of accountants. Patton moved with the speed of a predator. He was covering 70, 80 miles a day. He was outrunning his own supply lines and, more importantly, he was outrunning Eisenhower's control. The Supreme Commander's office at Schaeff was flooded with reports of Patton's progress, but they were always hours, sometimes days, out of date. Eisenhower found himself in a terrifying position. He was responsible for an army he could no longer keep up with. He needed Patton's momentum to win the war, but he feared that Patton's momentum was carrying them toward a strategic cliff as Patton swept through France. The personal rivalry between the two men reached a boiling point. Patton had become a rock star in the eyes of the American public. The man with the ivory-handled revolvers who promised to grease the treads of our tanks with the guts of the greasy Huns. This was exactly what Eisenhower feared. Patton's rhetoric was a diplomatic nightmare. He began making public comments that insulted the British, specifically Montgomery, whom Patton viewed as a tired little man. Eisenhower, tasked with keeping the Americans and British fighting as one, spent half his time writing letters of apology for things Patton said in his sleep. In private, Eisenhower's temper, usually kept under a mask of Ike's grin, began to explode. He wrote to Patton, warning him that his mouth was a greater threat to the Allied cause than the German army. But Patton, drunk on the smell of diesel and victory, simply laughed it off. To Patton, Eisenhower had become a paper shuffler, a man who had lost the soul of a soldier in the halls of Grosvenor Square. The conflict culminated in the broad front versus single thrust debate Patton argued that if Eisenhower gave him all the available fuel and supplies, he could drive straight to the heart of Germany and end the war by Christmas. Montgomery, surprisingly, wanted the same thing for his British forces in the north. Eisenhower stood between them, making a decision that still haunts military history. He refused to give either man the priority. He insisted on a broad front, moving all Allied armies forward at the same pace to ensure no one was cut off. To Patton, this was more than a mistake. It was an act of cowardice. When the fuel trucks finally stopped arriving at the Third Army's front, Patton was hundreds of miles ahead of everyone else. He was a tiger who had run out of oxygen. He sat in his command trailer, staring toward the German border, convinced that Eisenhower's caution had just extended the war by another year. The earthquake had been halted, but beneath the surface, the pressure was still building. Eisenhower had tamed the general, but he had also slowed the victory. December 1944. The war had turned into a cold, grey ghost. The lightning-fast advances of the summer were a distant memory, replaced by a biting, bone-deep winter that froze the fuel in the tanks and the blood in the men. Eisenhower, newly promoted to five-star general, was now a titan of bureaucracy, managing millions of lives from a heated office in Versailles. He had won the battle of logistics, but he was losing the battle of morale. The broad front had left his lines thin, stretched to the point of transparency. In the Ardennes forest, a quiet sector where exhausted divisions went to rest, the silence was about to be shattered. Eisenhower's methodical caution had created a window of opportunity, and Adolf Hitler, sensing the Allied complacency, prepared to throw his last iron die. On December 16th, the earthquake Hitler unleashed was so violent it threw the Allied command into a state of paralysis. 28 German divisions slammed into the thin American line. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. At SHAEF headquarters, the initial reports were dismissed as a local counterattack. But as the maps began to fill with red ink, the terrifying reality set in. The Allies were being cut in half. The methodical plan was in tatters. Eisenhower, for the first time since D-Day, looked truly vulnerable. He was surrounded by advisors who were whispering about retreat and evacuation. He needed a miracle, and he needed it in hours, not days. He realized that the very general he had spent months trying to suppress, the man he feared for his instability, was now the only man who could save the Western Front. On December 19th, Eisenhower called a council of war in a frigid stone barracks. At Verdun, the mood in the room was funerary. Eisenhower addressed his commanders, his voice low and tight. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster, he said, trying to project a confidence he didn't entirely feel. He turned to Patton, the man he had sidelined, the man he had reprimanded. "George, I want you to go to Luxembourg and take charge of the battle. When can you attack?" The room went silent. Most generals estimated it would take at least a week to pivot an entire army 90 degrees in a blizzard. Patton didn't even look at the map. He looked Eisenhower directly in the eye and said, "As soon as you're through with me here, I can attack with 3 divisions by the morning of the 2-1st." The room erupted in skepticism. It was an impossible, claimer logistical fantasy. But Eisenhower didn't join the laughter. He saw something in Patton's eyes that he hadn't seen in months, a sense of absolute divine purpose. In that moment, The architect surrendered to the warrior. He gave Patton the green light. What followed was the single most impressive feat of military leadership in the history of the US Army. In the middle of a record-breaking winter, Patton executed a 90-degree turn of 250,000 men and 130,000 vehicles, while the rest of the Allied army was reeling in shock. Patton's Third Army was a river of steel flowing north. Eisenhower sat back in Versailles, waiting for the reports, knowing that if Patton failed, the Alliance and Eisenhower's own career would be buried in the Ardennes snow. On December 26th, Patton's tanks broke the siege of Bastogne. The earthquake had met a mountain. Eisenhower's gamble on the man he feared had paid off. The German offensive was halted, and the killer general had saved the Supreme Commander's grand design. But even in victory, the tension remained. Eisenhower publicly praised Patton, but in his private correspondence, he noted that Patton's ego had only grown larger with the success. He had needed Patton to save the house, but now he had to figure out how to stop Patton from burning it down once they crossed the Rhine. The rivalry hadn't ended. It had simply entered its final, most dangerous phase. Eisenhower had realized that to win the war, he had to become comfortable with the chaos that Patton carried in his pocket. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was a shattered glass house, and George S. Patton was the hammer. He had crossed the Rhine, pausing famously to urinate in the river, as a final insult to the German people, and was now racing into the heart of the fatherland. But as the military victory became a certainty, a new, more terrifying conflict was emerging: the war for the peace. Eisenhower, now looking toward a world without Hitler, was increasingly preoccupied with the Soviet Union. He was a man of the long game, carefully adhering to the political boundaries set at the Yalta Conference. Patton, however, saw the world through the sights of a tank. He saw the Red Army not as an ally, but as the next enemy. He begged Eisenhower to let him take Berlin, to let him push all the way to the Soviet border. "We've got the best army in the world," Patton argued. "Let's finish the job now while we're here." Eisenhower's response was a final, cold no. The architect knew that a push to Berlin would cost 100,000 American lives and ignite a Third World War before the Second had even ended. The war ended in May, but for Patton, the silence of the guns was deafening. He was appointed as the military governor of Bavaria, a role that required the very things he lacked: patience, tact, and political sensitivity. He was a sword designed for striking, not for hanging on a wall. He began to publicly criticize the denazification program, famously stating that the Nazi thing is just like a Democratic and Republican election fight. It was the final straw. Eisenhower, now facing a mountain of diplomatic fire, realized that the general who had saved the Allied line in the Ardennes had become a threat to the very stability of Europe. In a tense, final meeting in October 1945, Eisenhower did what the German army never could. He removed George S. Patton from command. The old blood and guts was stripped of his beloved Third Army and reassigned to a desk job, overseeing the writing of military history. The warrior was dead before he ever left the field. On December 9th, 1945, the irony of history claimed its final victim. Patton, a man who had survived the lead-filled skies of the Great War and the panzer divisions of the Second, was paralyzed in a low-speed car accident near Mannheim. A truck had collided with his staff car, and Patton had been thrown forward, snapping his neck. As he lay in a hospital bed, he realized the ultimate tragedy of his life. "This is a fixed way for a soldier to die," he whispered. He lingered for 12 days before passing away in his sleep. Eisenhower did not attend the funeral. He remained in Washington, already being groomed for a political career that would lead him to the White House. The architect had survived the war and won the peace. The warrior had been consumed by the fire he helped ignite. Years later, when Eisenhower was president, he was asked about the generals who served under him. His reflections on Patton were always complex, a mixture of deep respect and lingering exasperation. He called Patton a brilliant commander, but also a man who lived in a different century. Eisenhower understood that history needs architects to build the world, but it also needs earthquakes to clear the ground. The relationship between the two men was never one of friendship. It was a marriage of necessity. They were the two halves of the American character, the methodical, democratic institution and the individual, restless spirit. Without Eisenhower's restraint, Patton might have started a war that could never be won. Without Patton's fire, Eisenhower might have lost the war he had so carefully planned. In the final accounting of the Great Crusade, the bitter alliance stands as a testament to the burden of command. It reminds us that victory is rarely a clean, simple thing. It is forged in the friction between men who cannot agree but must succeed. Today, Patton's legend is written in the steel of his tanks, while Eisenhower's legacy is written in the air. Maps of the modern world. One was the shield, and the other was the spear. And though they spent their lives at odds, they are forever bound by those 13 minutes of Verdun and the shared knowledge that sometimes, to save civilization, you have to let a monster off its leash.